the fulfillment of the Deuteronomy 18 prophecy that Moses makes of one who is going to come like him, who would be the new lawgiver. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that. And so what we see with Jesus as he teaches here in this Sermon on the Mount, as we call it, is that Christ is going to move from the external law. Now, I want you to listen and I want you to think about this. He is moving from the external law written on stone tablets that tell us what to do, to the essence, to the heart of the law for citizens of the new covenant kingdom. And as he moves from the law written on stone tablets, what is he moving to? Okay, so Moses brought down the 10 Commandments from Sinai written on stone tablets. What does Jeremiah tell us that the new covenant would be? Do you remember? Okay, Jeremiah 31 says that the law is no longer going to be the law written on stone tablets. Instead, it's going to be the character and nature of God, the heart of what the law is about, written on soft hearts, written on our hearts. And so what happens as Jesus talks here in this section is that he moves us from a law that tells us what to do to his essence of the law. And what is he telling us? What is Jesus calling out for us, to us with? As he, pardon? Okay, he moves from what to do to who to be. And that's really what we are coming across as we take a look at the first section of the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus gives his 9 short sayings in comparison to Moses' 10 short words. We talk about the 10 commandments. Actually, in the original, it's not commandments, it's words. The 10 words. And so Moses has 10 words to people in a brutal Bronze Age culture about what they need to do to begin to distinguish themselves from the world around them and to begin to be God's light into that world. Jesus takes and he says, okay, you understand the externals, now let's get to the heart of who you are to be, and let's understand who you are called to be. I was listening to a conversation a while back, a couple weeks back, between a fellow named Tom Holland, who is a very famous historian from England, and Sam Harris. How many of you have heard the name Sam Harris before? Okay, there's a few of you who know who Sam Harris is. Sam Harris is an atheist neurosurgeon who has kind of made it his mission to step away from neurosurgery, but to try and convince people that there is no God. So he's one of what they call they called him a couple of decades back, before these guys started to actually realize, wait a second, we're doing more damage than we are good. They called him one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheist movement. So it was Harris, Hitchens, Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett. And it's interesting because I've already mentioned to you that Richard Dawkins now says, after basically saying that, we want to do everything we can to get rid of Christianity, now he's saying, as he takes a look at the effectiveness of his work in Britain, he is saying, well, maybe we need God after all. Because he says, when you remove that, he's taking a look at British society, and he's saying, when you remove the great CCTV in the sky from keeping watch over the behavior of people, they become bad. And it's funny because Dawkins, that's where he's gotten to. Hitchens wrote a book called God Is Not Great. And after he wrote that book, God Is Not Great, and of course he's done speaking tours and he's been all over the world and debating and arguing and everything else. When he got to the end, as he started to die of cancer, And his brother Peter actually was kind of, he viewed Peter as his big foil, because Peter, coming out of the same family, had actually come to Christ and was a very outspoken writer for Christ. What ended up happening is, I remember listening to Hitchens' last words, and he was talking, or his last conversation, and he was talking like he almost was really wishing that Christianity was true because of how kind Christians had been to him in his dying days. I thought that was a really, really interesting thing, because he said he had received an outpouring of love from people who were Christian, even though he had been trying to tear down the Christian faith for years and years. And now Harris. So Harris is sitting down talking with Tom Holland, and they're talking about Tom Holland's new book, or book. It's been out for about a year now, and it's kind of made shockwaves through the literati, the reading community. And his new book is called Dominion. And Holland's new book is about the effect of Jesus on 2,000 years of Western history. And this is an interesting thing, because as they're in this conversation about this book, Holland hits Harris at the heart of his key premise. Because Harris's premise is, I can be a good man without Jesus. In fact, he calls himself part of what's called the ethical altruist school, and he figures that goodness has nothing to do with Jesus. And Holland, who himself was an atheist and has written this book, and I don't know if he's still in that position. I don't know where he's ended up at. But Holland said, you're wrong. He said, I thought that way too, and I was wrong. And here's why he said I was wrong. Holland's specialization, he's a professor, and his specialization was in Roman and Greek history. And he liked Egyptian stuff too, but Roman and Greek were kind of his area of specialty and focus. And these are, in a lot of ways, we look at them as admirable pinnacle civilizations. People look at Rome with amazement. And so we think of Rome and Greece, and we think of art, and we think of philosophy, and we think of architecture, and we think of great writers from this period of time, and we think of military power. And if you take a look at Rome worshipped the martial virtues, and it admired conquerors. And so we think of the fact that, if you think of your movie scenarios, a Roman general conquers, and then what happens is they had what they called a triumph through the cities of Rome. And that triumph was this big military parade, and everybody gathered to praise their conquering hero as he came into the city of Rome for whatever great battle he had won on behalf of the eternal empire. And the longer that Holland lingered inside of his own field of study, the more he realized how savage the moral and ethical principles of his greatest heroes were. And he looked and he said to himself, and this was his question, he said, as I looked at all of this, I had to think to myself, what is it in me that makes me recoil so much from these men that I've had admiration for? What is it that makes me pull back and say, well, he's not a very good guy? Why is it not that I respond to them like the people in their day responded to them, with straight on admiration and hero worship? He says, what is it that's making me feel this way? And the longer he lingered, the more he realized that he had to look to figure out what was shaping his thinking, because he knew that his thinking was very much the thinking of the culture around him too. And so here they were. Rome was all admiration for power and conquest, and with it, a contempt for slaves and for the weak and for the conquered. In Rome, might was indeed right. And might was actually, you might even call it virtue. Power was goodness. Power was what you aimed for. And being a conqueror and subjugating and harshly treating the weak was an inherent right of the powerful. The fact that you could go into a city and walk through rows of corpses hanging off of wooden crosses, bloody or rotting, was nothing that shocked the average Roman citizen. That was life in that culture. The fact that you would take an unwanted child after it was born and leave it on the rooftop for vultures to come down and eat, or leave it in the garbage dump outside of the city for the wild dogs to come and eat, that was normal in Roman culture. In fact, when we use the word to raise a child, the reason we had that English expression to raise a child was because the patriarch of a Roman family would decide whether he wanted a kid or not after it was born. And if he wanted the kid, then there was a ceremony involved in which he raised the child to Jupiter, and that was the indicator that that one wasn't going out to the garbage dump. And so you take a look at this and you think about this culture, and you think about, the more Holland looked at this, the more he wondered what had changed all of this, what had shaped his moral sensibilities, and what had shaped the moral sensibilities of Western Europe and North America and other parts of the world as well. And the more he studied and the more he researched, the more his study and research led him to attribute it all to the cross of Jesus Christ. Not just Christianity, but to the cross of Jesus Christ. And he attributed it to the cross. Pastor Zeth said a couple weeks ago, as we were doing introductory materials here, Pastor Zeth talked about the upside-down kingdom. He talked about Jesus describing an upside-down kingdom. Well, it's upside down to what was a normal human kingdom prior to that. There's a reason why, as we go all the way back to our study in Revelation, there's a reason why human powers are described in the book of Revelation as the beast. Because for Christians, they saw human power and human authority unshaped by the goodness of God as being savage, as being bestial. And so Zeth said that Jesus is talking about an upside-down kingdom here. The cross reflecting Old Testament law, but then completing it and reflecting God's mercy to the poor is the first time that the world has been told the man hung up on that emblem of shame is morally superior to his executioners. That was a shocking, and for the Greeks and Romans, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1, that was a foolish message. It was stupid to think that someone hung up on a cross could be the moral superior of those who nailed him there. That shouldn't be. And so Holland is making this point. He's talking about the fact that this produced a shocking upside-down ethic. Rome only respects and admires might. It admires world conquerors. And he says to Sam Harris, hey, you know, those morals and ethics that you have, that you think you have because you're essentially a good man? You've been swimming in 2,000 years of culture. Anything good that you do is piggybacking on the cross. And I thought, that's a really, and Harris didn't have anything to say. He couldn't respond to it. In spite of the fact that he's an ethical altruist, the fact is, his ethical altruism is a borrowed ethical set of principles. It's not something that comes just to people who live in the world of nature red and truth and claw. It's not something that comes out of a world that views us as simply a higher form of animal. It is something that comes as a result of the cross, which is the culmination and the heart of God's redeeming work in humanity as we see it through the Old Testament. So Rome thinks little of those who are weak. It thinks little of those who are not self-assertive. It thinks little of those who are not committed to conquest. It thinks little of those who don't impose their will. And now we read these words. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So what does meek mean? Pardon? Humble? That's a good word. Pardon? Gentle? Okay, good. Yeah. Lowly? Okay. Okay. Okay, all good contributions. As you read those words that Jesus spoke on that mountainside in his giving of the new covenant law, as you read those words, how does this turn the ethic of Rome upside down? He's living inside of a land that's been conquered by Rome. How does this turn the ethic of Rome upside down? Okay. So the whole issue of he said savagery versus humility, the whole understanding of where we stand before our Maker. Okay, Sylvia?
Just this morning on a sermon that I've been listening to, that Nero persecuted Christians not so much because of their belief in a one God, but the fact that they didn't participate in any of the worldly things of the world. Like they set themselves apart. They didn't participate in any of Nero's things. They were set apart from the world around them, and they were different. And he didn't like them.
Stuff and everything else that went with it. Yeah.
And he did not like that fact that they didn't blend in, so he wanted to get rid of them.
Right. So
You think of Nero and the attraction to savagery that he showed, and Suetonius talks about it, and when you there's all sorts of debate as to whether actually Nero had a brain worm or something that kind of that kind of extended his savagery and made it even greater than what it was. But the fact that he took a look and said, these are not people that take great joy in seeing wild beasts rip humans apart, and that take great joy in the bacchanalian pleasures of Rome. Yeah, okay.
okay.
So meekness requires self-control. Okay. Yes, Daryl.
I want to turn it upside down, and back then I would think that the brash, the arrogant, the strong were the ones that predominantly owned, and the poor, meek, humble were subjects.
Yes. Yeah.
This turns it upside down in that those humble and meek and lowly.
Yeah. Right. The idea that the earth
Is inherited not by mighty military conquerors who are causing rivers of blood to flow, but that it's actually inherited by people who are humble, who are lowly, who are not taking and inflicting on others. So that's what it does as far as turning Rome upside down. Now I want you to think about this, okay? Because this is a good thing for us to really understand in its fullness. How does this turn upside down the ethic of Jewish messianic expectation at the time.
Yeah.
Well, the Pharisees were all about the laws and following them to the T and behavior and everything, and then Jesus says, no, that's not it.
Okay,
It's
okay.
the heart.
So there is that.
There is that. There's something even more going on here. What do you think the Jews expected in the Messiah? Yes?
Expected the Messiah to come and conquer Rome and shove Rome out and relieve the Israels from their control.
Honestly, ultimately, they were looking for the same kind of conquest, weren't they?
Let's
This is going to be,
the infliction of military power that our Messiah will bring. He is going to be a great soldier leader who is going to wipe out our enemies and give us a kingdom. That's what they're looking for. And so we think about Jesus as he teaches, as he preaches these words. These words are a problem both for Rome and they're a problem for Jerusalem. Because in both cases, Jesus is turning upside down the way that they are thinking as he gives this new who we are to be directive. And what he says here is supremely favored by God. You know, that's what we said the word blessed means. Supremely favored by God. This is about the children of God, and this is about their identifying marks. He says supremely favored by God are the meek. And it's a good thing for us to take time and to think about that word meek as we see it occur in our English Bibles, because the English word has in some ways lost the force of the original in our popular thinking today. And it's even lost the force of the way that the early English word meek was used. Typically, if we were to talk in our culture and someone was to use the word meek, what would they be? What kind of synonyms would you come up with for the word meek in our popular culture today? Pardon?
mousy, okay? Weak, okay? I think that those are both pretty accurate. Typically, if you think of meekness in our day, mousiness
Or weakness is the idea. How many of you were ever fascinated by the King Arthur stories? Yeah, I was. I was very interested. I read various old versions of the King Arthur stories, and you know, you can probably trace it back to kind of the main fountainhead of those. Whether he was a historical character or not, I don't know. I did do a paper on that back when I was in high school, because I was fascinated by this guy who potentially was a Dark Ages Roman Britain, kind of the transition between Roman Britain and Britain and Celtic Britain. But the Mort d'Arthur is called, the death of Arthur. Is kind of like the compendium of the Arthurian stories. How many of you have heard the name Lancelot before? Okay, so tell me who Lancelot was. He was a knight, not just a knight. Who was Lancelot? Okay, he was favored. Come on, you don't know who Lancelot was. The greatest knight of Christendom. He was considered to be like the unconquerable knight. He was the knight that couldn't be defeated. He was the best with a sword, the best with a lance. But here's the interesting thing. If you go back to Thomas Mallory's Mort d'Arthur, Lancelot is described as the meekest man on the face of the earth. That's the way that the word was used in Old English. What do you think it means when it says that Lancelot was the meekest man on the face of the earth? Yeah. Yes. In fact, the picture that you have of Lancelot is again and again of him doing gentle things for people who are weak. I mean, this is the whole concept of chivalry. Someone who takes and uses their strength to do loving and gentle and benevolent and good things. And so when Lancelot is described as the meekest man on the face of the earth, the whole idea was that, yeah, he was capable of pulling that sword and swinging it around and doing damage if he had to, but it would only be to stop evildoers, and he did everything he could to protect those who were weak. And so you have this picture, and I don't know if you remember this or not, but it's said, the same thing is said, and precedent is set for this one, of course, in time, but the same thing is said of Moses in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3. Moses is described as the meekest man on the face of the earth, which is an interesting thing, because we know that Moses was an incredibly effective leader of people that were really hard to lead. People who God describes as stiff-necked, as stubborn, as wanting to go their own way again and again. And we see Moses, this man who takes and leads Israel, being described as the meekest man on the face of the earth. So rather than weak or mousy, what we understand of meekness is that the meek person is humble and so inclined to submit their power and rights to God's control and to godly use. The meek person is not fighting for their own wants, but they are trusting God. And instead of self-assertion and conquest, the humble are the ones who are promised global dominion in the world to come. And that goes absolutely against Rome. And that goes absolutely against the distorted idea of the Messiah that had developed in later Judaism. So as we think about this then, my question is this. When it says, supremely favored by God are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. What is Jesus, who is Jesus calling us to be? What would meekness look like in its visible practice? If you think about it, I mean, we understand that this isn't what to do, but we also understand that out of the heart come actions, come a way of being. We are called to be this internally, and then there will be a way of being that comes out of that. So what does it look like? What does meekness look like in visible practice? Yeah. Okay, good. That's good. So we see that's in James chapter 2. It says instead of grabbing the place of honor for yourself, it says take the lowest seat. Now, are you to take the lowest seat because you think if I take the lowest seat, they're going to put me in the seat of honor? Why do you think that is? What do you think the point is? What do you think the point is actually behind taking that lowest seat and the banquet table? What is James trying to explain to people as he talks about that? Pardon? Okay, you understand. You're not the most important person in the room. The world doesn't revolve around you. And probably, too, you do have a sense that I want to gift toward others this place of prominence. So we have this understanding. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So taking the lowest seat at the table would mean that the others would get the first choices.
Yes. Yeah.
It's a deliberate desire to bump other people up.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is an act of, in Romans chapter 12, verse 10, it talks about the fact of in honor preferring one another. It uses that phrase. And the whole picture there is of how do I serve and how do I provide good into the lives of others. Is that, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Okay.
if I would be honest, I was thinking of Steve Jobs,
Okay?
and there are a lot of people. So Steve Jobs was the founder of Apple.
Yeah.
Who say, "Oh man, he did amazing things. You
Yeah.
know, built this great empire of a company." But since his death, people have, and during his lifetime, people would often come forward and say, "He's a jerk."
Yeah.
Like, and he's not somebody that you want to be around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just was thinking about the difference between somebody who's meek and not meek.
Yeah.
And I mean, we genuinely want to be around those types of people. And
Capable, but
yeah,
in their capability,
kind.
kind. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Going back to what meekness looks like in practice, my first thought was like protecting those who can't protect themselves. So, like for
Okay.
example, fighting against abortion,
Okay.
and
Okay.
trying to protect unborn children.
Okay, using your abilities, your position, whatever you have in order to protect those who are not able to protect themselves. Okay? Yes?
The other thing I was thinking about too is just what this looks like in our churches. And it is actually quite amazing how often in churches fights develop because somebody is just trying to get their own way.
Right, right.
And somebody who is meek is able to say, no, this isn't an issue worth dividing over.
Yeah.
I don't have to get my way on this. And in fact,
Yeah.
any issue
Yeah.
is really only an issue if we're departing from Christ and what he says is right
Yeah.
and true.
And I think about this, I think about that same thing inside the context of even marriage and marriage relationships. So right now,
Like one of the things that I do is I do premarital counseling with couples, and at one point there's a conflict resolution portion that we teach through, and I use there's a kind of a 10-step process that's involved in that conflict resolution. But I said before you even come to that 10-step process, here are 3 important questions that you need to ask yourself when it comes to circumstances. One of the questions that you need to ask yourself is, who does this matter more to? The second question you have to ask yourself is, who is going to have to live with the consequences of this decision? And the third thing you have to ask yourself, and I think that this probably is the one that matters most, is, do I enjoy bringing joy to my spouse? So you take a look at that and you think to yourself about that in the consequence of most of our relationships. Am I someone who actually desires to bring good into the lives of other people? And that's a massively important thing. So I'm going to give you just a quick summary here, and then we're going to close in prayer. Okay? So meekness would look, I think, like this in its visible practice. And there's more ideas I'm sure that you can come up with in the expression of this, the explanation of it. Meekness would look like a servant heart rather than pushing for my own way. Meekness would look like taking my abilities and strengths and using them for benevolent ends rather than self-centered ends. And meekness would look like not being vengeful and driven by the desire to destroy someone when they cross me. And I think that those are things that we would see in the person who is meek. Servant heart rather than pushing for their own way, using abilities and strengths for benevolent ends rather than self-centered ends, and not being vengeful and driven by the desire to destroy when we've been crossed. And the question that I ask out of all of this then for us is the obvious and simple one. We ask ourselves, am I someone who is meek? Because the promise to God, from God, through Jesus Christ here, is that the meek are the ones who actually will delight in the fullness of God's kingdom in the days to come. The citizens of the kingdom of God are in fact people who give evidence of it because of the fact that their lives demonstrate meekness and that their hearts are characterized by meekness. Okay, so we're done. Let's pray, and we'll see you in a few minutes again. Okay. Father, thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for the beauty of your word. We thank you for your Son, and we thank you, Lord, as we listen to these words that Jesus Christ spoke, that we see him, we understand more fully what they mean because we are able to look at his life lived out. And Lord, we look with admiration on this and desire ourselves to be meek. We think of how quickly human admiration moves to the powerful, moves to those who conquer, moves to those who are able to assert their desires and designs and will. And then we see this, and we see powers and strengths and abilities that are shaped by hearts that are humble and that are employed for your honor and for good in the lives of those around us. And we pray that you would help us to be meek. Pray this in Jesus' name.